for Christians only, because that is explicitly not what this is about. And anybody who knows what, and of course, many people don't know because only a few of you do know what I talk about when I talk about an estuary, which is a place where Christians and non-Christians can talk together. I very much want non-Christians and people struggling with these questions to do this. Now, so then I said, well, why don't we do a week where we basically ask Christians to hold back? Because a lot of the questions we get week in and week out have to do with Christian topics, Christian books, Christian theology, and all of that conversation isn't terribly accessible or interesting to people who aren't in church or didn't grow up in church or something like that. And so I said, well, let's just do a special week for atheist questions. And I asked a couple of people, they saw, yeah, that sounds cool. And so then we set this up. We had a little bit of drama earlier in the week because Joey opened up a special question and answer section for this particular meeting today. And then there was some drama because some people were putting in many questions. And then Joey said, now Joey is one of the moderators here at the Discord. He's a member of the Sacramento local meetup. He does not identify as a Christian at all. But he's been one of the key members of our team in setting all of this up. And so Joey started saying, well, why don't we limit it to 3 questions per person, which is actually quite generous. I probably would have said 1 question per person. But he said, and then he started doing some editing and people were offended and complained to him that typical Christian thing, trying to rig the conversation. And Joey's like, I'm not a Christian. I'm just trying to help us have a better conversation. And so then I made a little video yesterday where I explained some of what we're doing today. And one of the comments was, see, you're basically trying to grow greenhouse tomatoes by having people answer in the Discord server instead of in the live chat. So there's 2 reasons for wanting to take questions and answers in the Discord server. One is the YouTube live chat does not allow for much back and forth very easily. And part of the reason I do this in the voice chat channel on the Bridges of Meaning Discord is because we can take live questions. If I try to answer someone's question and they're in the live chat, they can say, no, you haven't addressed my question at all, or they can ask a follow-up question. It gives a far richer experience than just reading questions that have been left on Patreon or in some other place and me trying to guess what exactly you're asking about. So that's one reason. Another reason, actually there's 3 reasons. Another reason is I do, in my manipulative Christian way, want to lure unsuspecting atheists into the Bridges of Meaning Discord server to make them Christians. Okay? I said it. It's right there. There's plenty of non-Christians in the Bridges of Meaning Discord, and they know that there are a lot of Christians here, and they have not taken offense by that fact. And what we're trying to do here is to have better conversations between people from different camps. And I think it's not in my control, and some of you understand some of the theology of my particular sub-tradition. It's not mine. I'm not in control of as to whether or not I can make you a Christian. So I'm not worried about, I just want to create an environment where people can have better conversations. And some people are going to walk out of there saying, well, I understand Christians a little better, still don't want to be one, still don't find myself believing. Okay, I can't make that happen for you. But I do want Christians to understand atheists better and atheists to understand Christians better. And so that's part of the reason we're doing this here. And Discord is not necessarily the easiest platform to get used to. And so this is sort of a way that people can dip their toes in and perhaps find a community that will be productive for them in terms of wrestling with some of life's biggest questions. And in many ways, that's what I think the Bridges of Meaning Discord server does. It creates a community where people can ask deep questions. Sometimes they'll play games. In terms of even little internet games, we have a lot of different rooms where people can come and make friends and try new things. That's sort of what what is happening on the Discord server. So I wanted to, and I also noticed, and just so this morning I was reading through the questions, and there are quite a few questions. Oh yeah, one other thing. If someone does post a question in the YouTube live chat, can some of you who can manage it technologically, if you find a question in the YouTube live chat that you'd like to see asked in the process, just cut and paste it into the Discord and I'll see it there. And so we can perhaps bridge that gap a little bit. I do have the live chat over on a computer next to me, so I can sort of keep an eye on it. Rick monitors it. And so when you see me answering questions in there, it's actually Rick. And so Rick sort of monitors that and tries to keep some order in that room. But just in looking over the questions this morning, wow, I love these questions. These are great questions. And this is part of the reason I am excited about working in estuary type spaces, is because so often I find there are better questions and better conversations when they're not necessarily coming from the hothouse of a walled garden like a church. Now, again, there's a reason for walled gardens, and there's reasons for controlled spaces, and there's reasons for all of those things. But you find different things in different environments. So the Bridges of Meaning Discord server is sort of an estuary. And if you look at how Joey set this thing up, it's really the Golden Gate Bridge, because you can have a separate bridge for your own locale if your group is big enough, and you can talk to Joey about that. But it's under the Golden Gate Bridge. This is the main estuary of the state of California. And I welcome sea monsters to come in from the ocean, and I welcome Christians to swim downstream into the salt water. And there's a reason why estuary spaces are some of the most productive habitats on the planet. It's something about the meeting of chaos and order that brings about some really interesting conversation. So that's why we're doing this. And this is the first time we're doing it. We'll see how well it works. But Roaring Monkey had 3 questions early on, right off the bat, and 3 excellent questions. Now, what we've done in the past too is that if you look at the questions in the Question and I Atheist Week hashtag room in the Discord server, and I know that's a little technical for some of you, and if you like some of them better than others, feel free to thumbs up them or use an icon or an emoticon to prioritize the questions, and that will help me know which of the questions that you see here you find quite salient. So let's dive in, and Roaring Monkey has 3 questions right off the bat. Now, I'll also say that Joey sort of went through these questions, and Rick did too, to take out some of the chatter that was between them. And we do this every week. So if you're an atheist and you say, "Oh, I missed Atheist Week," don't worry about it. Every week is Atheist Week, except the Christians get to play too on those weeks. So you can ask a question any week, no matter if you're a Muslim or an atheist or whoever you are and however you go. So don't worry about missing this week too badly. All right, let's I just got to silence my watch here so I don't get distracted too badly. Okay, first question from Roaring Monkey. How would I ever know if something is from the Holy Spirit or from another source? I know that typically people appeal to a being in line with appeal to it being in line with Scripture, but there are as many competing theologies as there are people who sit down to rigorous study of the Bible, not to mention the myriad other traditions that might provide interpretive lenses for any spiritual experience. So why adopt a lens that requires us to not pay attention to a larger portion of reality? That's an excellent question. When I was looking through a lot of the questions, many of the questions that are asked have a lot to do with a lot of the kinds of things I talk about in my channel. And that is God number 1 and God number 2. What do I mean by that? When I listened to Jordan Peterson talk to Sam Harris towards the end of their first conversation in Vancouver, it was immediately apparent that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris we're operating with two different meanings for the word God. And so I called Jordan Peterson's sense God number one, and the God that Sam Harris was pushing back against, God number two. And throughout my years of talking about this, I've continued to hone and refine the senses of God number one and God number two, what Jordan and Sam are talking about, to try to give a better understanding of what Christian theology long term has understood by God. Now, part of the reason John Vervaeke's work is so helpful in this is because there are a lot of things that we're doing when we're talking about these things that we can't pay attention to. One of which is using labels. Christianity grows out of Judaism, and my take on some of the best scholarship suggests that both Judaism and Christianity have always talked about God being something beyond just another thing in existence. Some traditions talk about God as being the ground of all being. That's somewhat analogous to God number one. But the God of the Bible is also an agent, and he acts within history. That's God number two. There's a distinction between what God wants and what we want. In other words, there's different agents, but our difference in agency is not always that distinct or discrete. And so questions like this first one, and actually quite a few of the other questions that arose, circle around this issue of agency. If you take a test and you fail the test, it's not unusual for the student to be upset by the fact that they failed the test, and they go home and protest that it was the teacher's fault that they failed the test. How could it be the teacher's fault that they failed the test when the student was the one giving the answer? Well, there's a lot of ways you can imagine it was the teacher's fault that they failed the test. Maybe the teacher didn't teach well. Maybe the teacher asked questions on the test that weren't covered in the class subject material. Maybe the teacher wrote a test that was too hard. The teacher's expectations were too high for the students to fulfill. There are many variables in that, yet in one way of looking at the question, we say, well, the student failed the test because the student was the one who put pencil to paper in order to answer the questions. But you can immediately see that the reality of the entire scheme is more complex than just whether the student or the teacher failed the test. Because the testing is, in some ways, a collaborative process that is, we simplify it in order to pursue certain ends, but it's enormously complex. Okay. When we talk about the work of the Holy Spirit, we talk about one of the three persons of the Trinity, and we talk about the Holy Spirit as person, as an agent, as one of the three persons of God. Now, I sometimes would tease, this is long before the Jordan Peterson stuff. I'd be sitting in a room full of Christians, and Christians are talking about their life and their personal relationship with God, and something dramatic happened in their life that was an answer to prayer or a really wonderful thing. And it is not uncommon right now in terms of evangelical language for someone to say, that's a God thing. And what they've sort of invoked is this division of agency. And that division of agency is certainly legitimate, okay? But it is not all there is in terms of the interrelationships of reality. The Bible is aware of this. You find it at the end of the book of Genesis. In fact, one way of summing up a lot of the book of Genesis happens when Joseph talks to his brothers, and his brothers are trying to somehow fix their relationship with him because, after all, they sold him into slavery and he might hold a grudge. And it might be that he's holding back on delivering the punishment against them that he is able to because he's second in command in superpower Egypt until after his father dies. And so the brothers cook up this scheme to try to preserve themselves from the possibility of Joseph's terrible power. And Joseph in the book of Genesis says, look, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And if you read the narrative in the text of the book of Genesis, it seems clear that the agencies exhibited are not monofocal nor monovocal. And what I mean by that is that it isn't the case that we can just always discreetly line up God's agency and our own as two different things. Now, sometimes there's some opponent agency in there, such as Jacob wrestling with God at the Jabbok. That's in the book of Genesis as well. So this all leads to a lot of questioning on our part, which is absolutely legitimate. Where does my agency end and where does God's agency begin? I don't know that we're going to be able to answer those questions to our satisfaction, and certainly not to the satisfaction of others. And so when it comes to the Holy Spirit, on one hand, the Bible in the book of First John challenges us to test the spirits and to discern the spirits. On the other hand, we're going to get a lot wrong. And anyone who pays careful attention to us will understand we're going to get a lot wrong. Now, the student who looks at the questions, the answers checked wrong on their test, yes, they got the answer wrong. The wise teacher might look at that and say, they got that question wrong. And most of the class got that question wrong. Maybe I didn't set up the test properly. Because the goal of the test is not, there are multiple goals of the test. Sometimes the goal of the test is to differentiate the top students from the bottom students. Sometimes the goal of the test is to motivate the students to actually go over the classwork or to get all their reading done. Sometimes the goal of the test is to, there can be lots of goals for the test. So all of this agentic stuff comes in here. Now, in some ways, this shouldn't be too hard for us to understand, because what has happened in the post-Christian environment is that people have pursued a new way of talking, which is to agentify the universe. And I hear this all the time in a lot of post-Christians. I see people who have given up on Christianity because, something really tragic happened in their life and they expected God to be there for them. Okay. This is very, very common. You can see it in Nathan Jacobs' Becoming Truly Human story. One of the big areas that people struggle with is the problem of evil. And the way that's implicitly set up in their mind is that God is this other actor in the universe. And the story that's told by one woman in Nathan Jacobs' movie is her uncle was a smoker and he went to bed with a lit cigarette, and that cigarette lit the mattress, and her uncle died a horrible death in bed. Would it have been so hard for God, who can do anything, to just send an angel next to the guy's bedside to quietly take the cigarette out of his sleeping mouth and put it in the ashtray, and the whole thing could be avoided? Can you honestly possibly tell me that God is love and it's too hard for him to send an angel down to take care of that little detail so her uncle could live? And this is partly fueled by a generation ago. We had all kinds of shows on TV like Touched by an Angel, and the angel would come in and move the cigarette. Or there's stories of angelic intervention where you can find them on the internet. They're all over the place, where a car was careening towards a baby carriage or a loved one, and somehow there was a mysterious stranger who moved them out of the way, and their life was spared, and they got up off the ground, and they couldn't find the stranger. There's stories like that all over the place. And what's the interpretation? God sent an angel. And so now we're stuck with the question, why did God send the angel to save that woman from the careening car, and God didn't send an angel to gingerly take the lit cigarette out of the mouth of my uncle so he wouldn't burn up in a house fire? I don't know. So people often at that point say, well, I can't believe in this whole Christianity thing, so I'm going to not believe in God. All right. So then they're angry with a God they don't believe in. And then they feel better by saying it's all just chance and randomness. Okay. I'm not sure how that's an improvement over a God who's making decisions that you can't understand, but have it your own way. But a few years later, I listen to such people and they're talking to the universe. See this all the time. And it's like, okay, so you were really unhappy, and understandably so, at a God who didn't save your uncle from the house fire. But now you're talking to the universe and you keep telling me how, well, I want this to happen. So I'm going to send good energy up into the universe so that I get winning lottery numbers. You've just changed the name, but you're pretty much acting under the same programming. A lot of now, how am I get? Am I ever going to get at the answer to this question about the Holy Spirit when we listen to the Holy Spirit? When someone says it's a God thing that somehow that car missed me and I'm alive, and I say, yeah, and so was the sunrise. The sunrise is a God thing. There's God number one and God number two. And if you look at something that I did with Vervaeke a while ago, I the reason we talk to the universe as we do, the reason we talk to our car that won't start, the reason we yell at the president through the TV is because that's the most reasonable way to approach agency that is too big for us to understand. Now, a lot of what religion tries to get at is improving our ability to relate to agents and powers and mechanisms, personal and impersonal, that are above and beyond us. And so there's a story about two Christian traditions trying to figure out where to church plant. So one tradition, like the Christian Reformed Church, goes and looks at the demographics, looks at the percept studies, looks at all of the business studies, and says, oh, suburban Sacramento would be a wonderful place to plant a church because all of the reasons we know here. People are more open to attend church when they have a move in their life and they're looking for new friends, and more people are moving into that neighborhood. And so this would be a great place to plant a church. And so all kinds of heady, brainy, scientific, business type people in the Christian Reformed Church decide they're going to plant a church in Elk Grove. And they get there, and who do they find but the Pentecostals? And what do the Pentecostals say? God told us to plant a church in Elk Grove. And I snicker. Now, I can very easily imagine that a lot of God telling them to plant a church in Elk Grove was the unconscious parts of their brain picking up signals that a lot of business people had sort of quantified in all of their studies. And that got melded into God telling the Pentecostals to plant a church in Elk Grove. Is God not telling them that? Is God not speaking through the data? Does God not speak through the sunrise? Does God not speak through the fire retardants in the pajamas of the uncle so that he doesn't lose his life in a fire because he drifts off to sleep with a cigarette in his mouth. There's no getting around any of this. So it's absolutely appropriate to ask God for wisdom and intervention and answers. And see, when I talk like this, then people imagine, to go back to a video I just made and posted yesterday, people imagine I sound like a modernist. Oh, you're saying God doesn't act or hear. No, I'm saying he does. And I'm saying you should definitely call out to him. But what I'm also saying is that the relationship, if you can understand that there's relationship in the complexity of why a student failed a test, you can probably understand that there's innumerably more complexity in these questions about God. So then what should people do? People should pray. People should ask God, and they should go ahead and engage in it, because to not engage in it seems simplistically biased to me. And what you're actually doing to not engage in it is taking offline almost all of the most powerful relational tools that, okay, I'll talk like an evolutionist, that evolution has delivered to you to deal with a very complex reality. It's so funny how certain atheists will say, well, we have this hyperactive agency detector. And in the past, that has helped us survive because we see the bush move and we think it might be a lion. So we act as if there's a lion in the bush. Well, I'm going to tell you something. The atheists will all tell you right off the bat, the universe is plotting your destruction. And in fact, you're going to lose. All of the various systems in your body that keep you alive, one of them is going to fail, or a car's going to plow into you, or you're going to fall asleep with a cigarette in your mouth and not only burn your house down, but fry yourself in the process. That's what this world is like. Now, it's a harder question to ask. Why would a good God allow such a world to evolve? That's a really hard question. And I have a lot of respect and understanding, sympathy, and in fact, members of my own consciousness Congress are right there saying, yeah, that's a really good point. And it's a really hard point. Yeah, it is. But as a sort of pragmatic answer, I would say that hyperactive agency detector you have is there for a reason. And it might cause you a lot of anxiety, but you have absolutely no proof that there aren't agents above and beyond us. You have, in fact, I think, little good evidence that these ancient ways of conceptualizing the universe aren't, in fact, for many reasons, superior, and you're better suited to it. It's sort of like someone wanting to play a really complex game, and I'm going to probably show my illiteracy in terms of the computer gaming world. Someone wants to play Fortnite on a Raspberry Pi. How do I know what a Raspberry Pi is? Because I hang out with Rick. And someone wants to play Fortnite on a Raspberry Pi, and someone will say, you don't want to try playing Fortnite on a Raspberry Pi. It's not going to run. Okay. So I'm going to try and play Fortnite on my Chromebook. And someone will say, you don't want to try play Fortnite on your Chromebook because that doesn't, well, what kind of computer do I want to play Fortnite on? Well, you want to get something with a beefy CPU and a decent GPU. What? That Windows integrated graphics isn't good enough? No, it's not good enough. In your brain, you have all of this incredibly powerful relational, imaginative capacity that you depend on to navigate in this world. And what I see a lot of people doing by saying, I don't believe that there are any agents above us or beyond us. Oh, you're going to take all that GPU power offline and still you're going to play the game? Good luck. Evolutionarily, I can look back and say the reason human beings have got this far is because they used their CPU and their GPU to play the game. And that's why religions are adaptive. Now, I'm not making an argument that it's true. I'm just making an argument that it's better. And I think this basically is what Jordan Peterson did in a very implicit way. And everybody's lights came on. And that's, we're all downstream from Jordan Peterson, or at least most of us. So to answer your question about sources, agency, number one, agency is far more complex than me or God, even though that distinction is very important and manageable. Number two, don't leave the most powerful tools that you have in order to engage this world that is far more complex than you are off the table when, in fact, you want to engage with it. Use your imagination. Talk to the universe. Talk to your car. Yell at the president on the television set. Now, if there are other people in the room, you might want to curtail some of that for other reasons, but we all manage enormous complexity with all of these tools. And then I watch on the other side, people say, we're going to take these tools offline because we fool ourselves with them. Yeah, we do. You're right. And that even trick of taking things offline is a neat trick so as not to fool ourselves. But then what I watch a lot of people do is put those tools right back online without acknowledging it or recognizing it to try to engage in this very complex world. So the world is big. And so my advice to people is get on your knees and pray to God and say, Lord, do something, because I am small and I am barreling towards death. And if you're out there to hear me, lend me a hand. I don't find that to be a bad or an irrational strategy. So let me see if that answers some of the other questions, because that will actually address a lot of what I say in this. Well, let me get a chance to take a little drink here to see if anybody in the comment section wants to comment on my half-hour sermon on question number one. We're doomed to get at all the questions. So anyway, go ahead.
Would an appeal to conscience be appropriate?
Yes, because from below, what is our conscience? Or what might our conscience be? We don't even really know. It might be just sort of the first draft that we have concocted about what morality is. And just recently in a conversation, Jordan Peterson, talked about conscience and morality. And it was his conversation with Mark Manson. And I thought what he said about that is very, very right. We should listen to our conscience. And when we violate our conscience, again, from below, what we are doing is going against sort of the summation that we have come to as to what is right and what is wrong. Now, obviously, if this is framed with a very robust view of God, see, God, that little three-letter word, is the most powerful adaptive mental variable you can imagine. Again, I'm talking from below. I'm playing the Jordan Peterson trick here, but that's exactly right. Appeal to conscience. What is our conscience? Where does it come from? From below? We can make a good case for what it is. All right.
So
go ahead.
I was the one who asked that question, and just the reason I was trying to emphasize the point of the Holy Spirit, right, is that that's a specific bit of language which is associated with a bunch of theological doctrines and other ideas, which will then shape how you then go and pay attention to this organ that we can speak of as receiving an immense amount of data at all times, which you can refer to as your heart or your soul or your body, however you want to talk about it, right? And so, yeah, I guess that was kind of like the core of it, is that you can, I think it's pretty possible to open yourself up to that way of engaging in the world without necessarily positing that the source is this specific phrase from a tradition which has a whole bunch of baggage attached to it, which is maybe the benefit of somebody just saying the universe, if it vibes with them better, if it's open-eyed, right?
Yep.
But I think you pointed out that sometimes it's not always open-minded, and I would agree with you that if it's not a conscious decision to open oneself up to that, then that's gonna, anything that's done in that kind of not thoughtful way is not going to be super helpful. But
Right.
yeah,
And so let's say if you decide to do the post-Christian trick and talk to the universe. When I watch people do this, what I usually watch them do is eventually they start basically trying to reconstruct what religious traditions have been constructing for the last few thousand years. Because,
right.
well, is the universe benevolent or malevolent? So the same universe that maybe gave them an insight into a winning, the numbers popped into their head in terms of a winning lottery ticket, that same universe burnt their uncle to a crisp in the smoking accident. And
Yeah.
and so then we
Yeah.
get back to the question, which is really the much harder question: is the universe good or not? And that's, I think, in many ways the question that religions and we've all been wrestling with and answering, or trying to
Yeah.
answer in many ways.
Which is why I think, like, to my mind, something like just mindfulness meditation, or like a more Buddhist perspective on it, is somewhat more helpful to some degree, wherein you're not positing that there is a thing called the universe which has some sort of goal that is consistent over time, or a thing called God, which is like outside of you and outside of the universe, like an extra thing. But it is, we're talking like the totality of all possible things, right? What kind of purpose could that have, malevolent or benevolent, other than it is just the manifestation of all of the things that coming into being together, right? That whole codependent origination idea makes it really difficult to tease out something like one specific teleological goal. But yeah,
And those are difficult questions. The answer I would have would be, let's imagine that you're hiking in Arches National Park in Utah, and there's all these beautiful stone arches there. And you want to walk across the top of one because that would be really cool. And the thing is that these arches are fragile and they can come down at any time, or maybe you want to walk under one. Do you feel better either walking on it or under it, knowing that, or assuming that there's absolutely no purpose or intentionality with respect to me and this arch? Now, that might give you a sense of adventure and excitement. Or would you rather walk on an arch that you have some degree of understanding that an engineer has built this and has understood that certain numbers of people can walk on it? In other words, that's analogous to, let's say, a bridge that is in all of our cities. And so when we say, I prefer a universe in which that nothing is mindful of us, well, then sort of we're opting for the natural arch. But if we say, I prefer a universe in which there is actual intentionality for our good, then we're opting for an engineered, constructed bridge. Now, it's interesting that when it comes to us building our cities, or building our airplanes, or any of that, we trust in human engineering because it's built for us. Now, that doesn't answer the question, whether or not there's purpose in the universe, but it always strikes me as peculiar that on one hand, we want to say, I don't think there's any intentionality. This wasn't made for us. But then we go ahead and live in cities and fly on airplanes that, in fact, were designed for us, instead of the opposite, when the opposite is available to us. So, and I think the reason for that is that if you have a religious philosophical system that says, okay, it's designed for us, that there's purpose here, and then Uncle Joe dies in an accident with a cigarette in a bed, now we're back into Eric Weinstein land, that if there's a God, we have to worry that's what's on his mind. We would almost rather say that the universe is indifferent towards us, than the universe is plotting our misery, suffering, and extinction. So it's all these little mental biases that we have, that we bring to these questions, and it's very interesting how the menu of possibilities has sort of played out in terms of the menu of religious traditions in the world.
Mm. I guess that's kind of for me, the point that I come to is that you should want to, like, my goal is to give as many options as possible to myself and to others, right? So that if there's something that doesn't work for a person, that isn't adaptive, that they don't have to feel as if the options are maintain themselves in a structure that causes huge cognitive dissonance for them potentially, or causes them huge amounts of anxiety about actually being able to know the purposes of God or whatever it might be. And to maintain this idea of purposiveness in the universe, it's like either I have to remain a Christian, for example, or it's all nihilism, or I have to completely like thrust myself into a foreign like tradition like Hinduism or New Age or Buddhism, right? Like either that or it's just all nihilism. When I think that it, I don't see it as an either or situation. Like I think you can let go of some of those structures and maintain this like this sense that there is a purposiveness. However, again, the question I was asking is about like the epistemology of like how do you know what the like everyone has to struggle with how do they know what the purpose is, right, for them in any given situation. And yes, like for sure, if it vibes with you, if it works for you, to get on your knees and ask God, right? But my experience was that it never really felt like anything other than me pretending to like looking for some sort of imaginary thing, like really having to put my imagination to work, which you could say like that is part of like that is still part of reality. My imagination is part of reality, but it wasn't useful in that sense. It didn't elucidate any of the other parts of the tradition that I was really engaged in. Just a bit of background, I was a Bible college student for 2 years. I was heavily involved in church for a long time. So yeah.
Yeah, no, and this is exactly why I do this on Discord, because I love stories and I love hearing your story, and knowing your story adds a lot of context to the question. I also know that going the other way has, I mean, so we tend to say, okay, well, it's better that we have more options. But then you look at studies that have to do with increasing the options for people. And again, Peterson talked about that, I think, in his conversation with Matt Ridley. There's a funny thing that happens with people and options is that they've got buyer's remorse and dissatisfaction because there are more options. I mean, this stuff is really it becomes sort of like spy versus spy. It gets really tricky in terms of, okay, what is better? How do we decide what is better? In other words, would you rather, if someone said, if someone in 1912 said, I am going to give you you can either have a first class luxury ticket on the best, fastest ocean liner between England and America, or you can have a third class ticket on a crappier ocean liner to get from England to America, you would say, choice is wonderful. I want the first class ticket, and say, congratulations, welcome to the Titanic. If you had taken the crappy ticket, you would have got there. And life is just so full of those kinds of things. And choice is such a funny variable in this, because even once, and this is, a lot of the interesting conversations that we've been having, at this point, once choice comes into the mix, can we in any way really inhabit any of the traditions? Or does that element of choice and a consumer posture suddenly destroy the rich foundness and concrete nature of a tradition that will be able to deploy its values. And that's right where we get sort of into this meaning crisis business. So now these are great questions, and I really appreciate you taking the time to ask them and coming into the server today to voice them.
Yeah, Joy made a point as well that we can probably skip my next two for future Q&A because we can get to other people's stuff. But thanks for engaging with that. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. And again, for those listening on YouTube, this is why I do it in the Discord server, because we have a chance to do this. And just that little information about your life, Roaring Monkey, adds so much to now. See, now instead of just dealing with this question out there, I'm dealing with a person. And so now all of this other machinery in my mind, my heart is now connected with you after I've heard your voice, and I move towards you. And so we like to think of these answers as sort of these sterile things that are out there, timeless, spacelessness. But now the question is between two people. And that doesn't just, say, tip it in the way of Christianity. No, because in some ways now some of these challenges to the faith have more power. So that's why I do what I do.
Yeah, I've been trying to get it. But anyway, I just said, on that point, I have been trying to get a little slot with you at one point, but I haven't managed to snag it yet. But we'll have a conversation at some other point, I think.
Yes. I'll be opening up some more rando slots soon. It's just a function of time, and I get so many requests for conversations. It's really hard to know to be able to sort it out. And so that's, again, part of the reason that I do this like I do. So we can get 15 or 20 minutes now, and maybe we'll get an hour later. And it sounds like you and I could have a wonderful conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. Hope it happens. All right, Corvus Osai. So I think I've got a handle on God number 2, the divine principle, first mover. Actually, no. Aristotle is more God number 1-ness, because he doesn't see us. He doesn't relate to us. So God number 1 is arenic. It's kind of like the arena. God number 2 is the agent. God number 1 is immanent. God number 2 is transcendent. God number 1 is impersonal, sort of natural theology-ish, general revelationist. God number 2 is personal, special revelation. Again, I use God number 1 and God number 2 sort of as boxes on a theological, philosophical workbench. And I tend to throw things in. And so people will sometimes challenge me and say, "Oh, you're not being consistent." Well, that's probably true. But my whole YouTube channel is a workbench to sort some things out. And you all are co-laborers with me in it. And that's, again, why I so value people who have deconverted from Christianity or deconstructed from Christianity, and because you make me better by your questions, and the quality of questions exhibited today bear that out. Next week might be Atheist week too, if we keep going at this rate. Anyway, for me, the problem is that someone who grew up in the charismatic tradition, I was raised to believe that I had a personal relationship with God, and that God being was, at least in the popular imagination of that tradition, the very sky daddy that Sam Harris argues against. That's exactly right. It's God number 2. That's exactly what Sam Harris is saying. And that's why I don't think it's actually the ontology of God that the big disagreement goes to. I think it's I think what we're really dealing with is the question of the efficacy of the religious machinery that was designed to yield spiritual, I used that word, was designed to yield the preferred outcomes for our prayers. And in that way, this conversation isn't any different from an ancient Hebrew saying Yahweh is a living God, and the Moabite saying, yeah, but if I have another kid and put it on the fire of Molech, my crops really grew well that year. So, why did Elimelech and Naomi travel with their sons to Moab? Because there was no bread in Bethlehem. I just had Ruth on our men's Bible study the other night, so it's fresh in my mind. I got to the age of 22 or so and realized I didn't have a relationship with the Sky Daddy, and that whatever I thought I'd been talking to was essentially my inner voice or conscience. Yeah. For an example, my mom used to, and still does, ask God whether she should buy a sweater when she goes shopping. She actually is just asking her own intuition. I don't think God has any opinion on the matter. But again, if you look at this framework, implicitly, this Sky Daddy is sort of like Iron Man or Thor. And it isn't exactly, and so that's why it's a completely understandable evolution that Verizon Lisa walks down the street and she's talking to the universe about a new cell phone, and my goodness, there's a Verizon store right there. You're not wrong. You're dealing with the right questions, and we're all dealing with them together. But the answer to that has been, okay, that's a whole lot of make-believe. It's probably not just make-believe. And then we have to deal with the reality that all that make-believing has brought us into a world of cell phones. Say, no, it was science that brought us into a world of cell phones. Yeah, but what brought us into a world of science? And then, you listen to Jordan Peterson talk about Jung and alchemy, and suddenly the picture got confusing. So my question, what does that personal God being mean to you versus what the God being that the churches I grew up in imagined God to be? How do you articulate that? And how is it distinct from your conscience? What I say to this is always the God of redemption is the God of creation. And similar to the first question I was answering, the God who has made the world, and this is part of the reason I always go back to the Tolkien reference. Frodo is trying to get to Mount Doom Frodo and Sam are trying to get to Mount Doom to throw the rings in. Frodo is sitting with Gandalf in the mines of Moria because Sauron cut off the pass and they can't go by Rohan, so they're going through the mines of Moria. And I'm riffing off the movie now. And Gandalf says, yeah, Gollum's been following us the whole time. And Frodo says, I wish Bilbo hadn't stayed his hand. I wish Bilbo had killed Gollum when he had the chance. And Gandalf says, don't be too quick to wish that, because you don't know. Well, what is Frodo sort of banking on? Frodo is banking on that when he and Sam are going to march down to Mount Doom and they're going to get over the fire and he's going to throw it in there and evil will be gone. And what Frodo doesn't calculate on is the power of the ring to deal with the evil in his own heart. And in all of Middle-earth, because of his smallness, Frodo has seemed to be one of the most resistant people to the lures of the ring. More resistant than Gandalf would be, more resistant than Galadriel, more resistant than Boromir. But yet at the end, Frodo has a problem. And it's ironically only Gollum, in a strange twist of events that Frodo would not have desired or anticipated, that actually leads to the destruction of the ring. Okay. So Frodo prays to Tolkien. Why, oh why, Tolkien, didn't you have Bilbo kill the Golem? How's Tolkien supposed to answer that? Tolkien would probably be silent. Think, Frodo, you've got a journey to make. And listen to Gandalf. You don't know. Neither does Gandalf. Gandalf has some intuitions about the way the world works because Gandalf is very, very old. And in that sense, Gandalf is sort of like the Bible. Gandalf is sort of like a tradition, and just basically gently tells Frodo, even the wise can't see all ends. So I am more like Frodo in the story. I don't know all ends, but I think I have good reason to believe that it's best to stay in the fellowship and try to work towards smuggling that ring through Mordor into Mount Doom, and to trust that there are older, wiser, more powerful things at play in this world that I can't understand, and that the writer of the story is writing it for good, and that the story actually has purpose, and I can participate in that purpose even when I mess up. So I tell a story like that to fuel our imagination in terms of maybe there is good. Maybe God has a use for my deconstruction and my unbelief. Maybe God can work through things that all of our codes of laws and right and wrong say are wrong. And maybe I'm just making this up. But I don't think so. And I intentionally build my life to imagine I might have some good reasons for it. So it's a great question. And it's in some ways the same question we keep answering again and again and again and again because it's too big for us. So I don't know if you want to, I see you're in the voice chat, and I know not everybody here can talk, Corvus. So if you want to come back or sharpen it, go right ahead.
I think I'm good for now, but thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. DJ Roush. I have two questions for PVK. Some context. I grew up in a Christian home. As a child, I prayed fervently for God to make me a born again Christian. Ooh, he might not be done with you yet. But I never sensed God's presence or response in my prayers. I worried the reason God didn't answer is because I was predestined for hell. Yeah, that's not a good reason. I don't know. I doubt that that's true. And this is a Calvinist talking to you. Eventually, I stopped praying altogether and lost my belief in God. Christians have told me I should start praying again, but now I am wary that I will misinterpret what follows prayer as an answer from God when it is really just confirmation bias. Yeah, as a pastor, I mean, and I love the story told before. You know, I'm going out into the world to see if God speaks to me through a dress at Nordstrom's. Well, my guess he probably will, or it might not be God. Yeah, you've got plenty of reason to be cynical and cautious and skeptical about these things. I don't think that's a flaw in the system. I think that's some truth. And again, I do believe that if Christians read their Bibles better, these things won't go away, but they would have more resources to wrestle with them, because I find the Bible to very much understand these questions and deals with them in narrative form. We had our men's Bible study the other night. We were talking about Ruth. And what I find is that the narrative of the Bible is able to deal with these questions at far higher resolution than a lot of the simplistic moralizing that a lot of Christians do with the Bible. For example, are Moabite women dangerous? Well, if you read Numbers 25, yeah, Phinehas in his zeal puts a spear through an Israelite lad and a Moralite hottie copulating in a tent. And Phinehas becomes Phinehas becomes the emblem of zeal for the Lord. And a whole tradition goes by him. And, the Apostle Paul later will say he's zealous for the Lord. Okay. But then in the book of Ruth, this Moabite hottie named Ruth basically saves Israel and brings about the coming of David and eventually Christ. Both of those stories are in the Bible, and they're meant to be set next to each other. And that gives us an amazing, nuanced view of the world. So, yeah, I'll keep going with the question. My question is this: is it possible to be a Christian without feeling the presence of God? Yes. Or any communication from him? Yes. There is a biography of Mother Teresa written by James Scopp, who is a retired English professor from Dordt College in the great state of Iowa. And that is one of the few books that you can find that I have a blurb on. And my blurb on the back is very short. You can find that book on Amazon, and maybe after this, I'll find a link to it and put it in the comments for the show. But James Scopp has this biography of Mother Teresa. And what I love about that biography, it's a very short one, is it highlights the fact that Mother Teresa felt that God had abandoned her. That's what she felt. And this takes many people by surprise because they would imagine, oh, someone like Mother Teresa certainly had a very close and intimate personal experience of God all the time. And that's not true. She didn't. In fact, she had very much the opposite. And somehow, don't ask me how, somehow in her case, this didn't really lead to unbelief. This led to her spending her life trying to give a little bit of solace to people dying on the streets of Calcutta. What a bizarre story. There's another strange story with Mother Teresa where some high status Christian man from the States makes a pilgrimage to visit Mother Teresa because he's heard about her great saintliness and her wonderful sacrifice. And he's, saints, well, aren't those the way to get better in touch with God? So he travels to India and says, Mother Teresa, I want you to pray for me. And by this point, she's probably hugely annoyed that all of these people from all over the world are coming to bother her all the time. Why can't they leave her alone in her misery? And they have all these requests, but hey, she's a Christian. If she's going to pick up people off the streets of our Calcutta, I guess she'll have to tolerate these wealthy, high status North American Christians who are looking for insider information from God and looking to work up the saintly tree. And so says, all right, what do you want me to pray for? I want you to pray that God give me clarity in what I should do. And Mother Teresa whips around and says, I'm not going to do that. And of course, wait, I thought saints were quivering masses of availability. And no, actually, you find saints are often sort of obnoxious and matter of fact and surprising in that way. Well, Jesus wasn't particularly nice on many occasions. So he said, well, why won't you pray for me for clarity? And she says, because clarity is exactly what you don't need. What you do need is trust. Well, what does that mean? Well, she doesn't say, and I'll extrapolate on the story because the story is found in a different book from my friend's book. But the basic thing is this. When we pray to God and look for clarity, part of us, what are we really looking for? We're looking to use God as a source of insider information so that we're going to do better in the stock market. We're going to pick lottery winners. We're going to choose a spouse that we're going to have a happy marriage with. We're going to pick a job that will make us wealthy, and every day we'll be going into work having a high old time because our job is a bed of roses. That's what we're looking for, right? And we're looking for God to give us insider information to be able to detail our life like we want it. And basically, we're looking for what Frodo was looking for. I wish Bilbo had killed Gollum. And God says, nope, it's not the kind of stories I write. My greatest saints suffer the most. And sometimes what they suffer from is my ignoring them, my not giving them those warm fuzzies and those spiritual moments and those spiritual highs that you can reliably reproduce with a smoke machine and the ex-drummer from Journey and 5,000 people singing love songs to Jesus. Sometimes I make saints out of people who have horrible lives. Read John Ortberg's story of Mabel in his book entitled The Life You've Always Wanted. That's the evidence. That's the story. Now, praise be to God, for many of us, we have lives that are wonderful and churches that give us pleasure and marriages that at least to some degree or another work out and jobs that don't suck and bodies that work reliably at least for the first 40, 50 years of our lives and medical technology and all these wonderful things. That's great. But are you looking for God to have God give you a great life? Well, then you're just really being selfish. And there's not necessarily anything bad about being selfish. You should want a good job. You should want to be happy. All those are good things. But if there's anything we can learn from this world is that all of us can imagine which is amazing in and of itself. All of us can imagine a world which more reliably produces the kinds of things that we want than we do now. And this given from most of us who live in the developed world that have that to a greater degree than any other massive population in all of human history. And so what that says is, it isn't good enough. We still want it better. There's a function of humanity. So yes, you can be a Christian without feeling the presence of God. Some of the greatest Christians have become the greatest Christians because they haven't felt the presence of God. And two, if I do feel God's presence, hear his voice, or perceive an answer to my prayers, how will I know it's really him and not my imagination? Another source, a reverse testimony by Andy Crouch is one of my favorite little things that I ever read, because I've told this story before. Because here's a guy who's a young, earnest Christian, and he's got to make a decision in life, and he's fallen in love with a girl, and he wants to know if he should change his plans to stay with the girl or if he should move to another city. And he had never had an outstanding audible answer to prayer. And he's praying, oh God, I want, please just make your will clear. And for the first time in his life, he hears an audible answer to his prayer. And I might have the story wrong, but you can look it up. The answer is go. He didn't want that answer. And so kind of surprised him that he heard it. And well, maybe I'm just making this up. So he prays some more and he gets it again. And he doesn't go because it's not what he wanted to do. And so, well, how does this work? Did God call his bluff? The Mother Teresa bluff? Did God say, oh, you really think this is about clarity? Oh, okay. I'll be clear with you. Will that make a difference? And again, I've used this illustration before too. What is unclear to us about, some very basic things about our health? Going to the doctor, don't drink so much, don't drink at all, quit smoking, lose weight, exercise. There's nothing unclear to any of us about any of those things. Yet we smoke and drink and eat poorly and don't exercise and do all kinds of things that are going to hasten our death. And we know this. So here we are. This is how we are. And so then we point fingers to heaven and say, if you were only clear. Okay. Is it really clarity that you'd like? I don't think we would. And I think there is some generosity in God's hiddenness. And if we were to ponder, why do all these verses say, if we see God, we'll die? Why in the book of Revelation do the great and the small call upon the mountains to fall on them, to save them from the face of the one on the throne and the wrath of the Lamb? How do lambs have wrath? So it's a strange business. Oh, let's see. Let's see if you're in the room. I don't see your name. So I'll keep going. Joey, It could be said that Western New Age enthusiasts with activity like yoga, tarot card readings, meditations are practicing light versions, I'd say even LITE light versions of exotic or ancient religious rituals. Yes, I think that's true. With many positive and a few negative impacts on their personal life. Yes, I think that's true. Are there any Christian light practices and behaviors you would recommend for non believers that are productive even in the absence of belief? Oh, I think actually, and I think this is part of Tom Holland's point, we are surrounded by them. We are swimming in them. You know, Tom Holland calls secular humanism Christianity light. And I think he's exactly right. Now, when it comes to practices, well, we've got them all over the place. Marcus sent me a paper about Sunday blue laws. And in some places of the country, they still want things closed on Sunday. Why? Because you know what? We can all just use a day of rest from our consumerist society. So yeah, take one day out of 7 as a day of rest and figure out how to best rest in that day. And you can look at Jewish and Christian wisdom traditions to say, well, maybe I won't go shopping, or maybe I won't go to work, or maybe I won't answer email. I find these kinds of ideas just all over the internet. I'm going to take a digital Sabbath. Well, there's Sabbath. There's actually tons of them, and they're all over our society. Why do we pause each year and celebrate Christmas? Why do we celebrate Easter? I mean, our calendar is littered with these holidays, and our shopping malls at Christmas aren't filled with only Christians. In fact, many times Christians are so all over the place on many of these things. So no, it's the work is full of them. And church is like that. A question later, someone asks, are there people in church that don't believe in God? Yeah, lots of them. And there are lots of people in church who are angry with the God they do believe in. So it's a mess, but it's if there's one thing about people, we're all over the place on just about everything. So yeah, Sabbath, I think, would be one thing that is really helpful to practice. But I think if you look at what Christians do and you look at what's sort of baked in society in a lighter way, you'll find them all over the place. And yeah, it's great. It's a great question. All right, Grim Grizz. If you've no personal experience, if you've not personally experienced the arena as a gentic, and you've grown up either a secular home or one in which you've been abused by people who go to church on Sundays and present as Christian or flavored denomination in the world at large, why would you risk going into a closet and praying to God? It's a good question. But it's not much different from the person who's talking to the universe. I think we're just built this way. That's why prayer is so ubiquitous, and about the only way you get people to stop praying sometimes is shame it out of them. And that doesn't mean that, and I regularly have the experience of dealing with people who haven't been raised in a Christian home, and they will just tell you, I don't know how to pray. And that's true. But even people who, when Jesus' disciples come and ask him, tell us how to pray, these are people who have been steeped in prayers their whole lives. So, sometimes Anne Lamott has a great little line. She says, I have my 2 favorite prayers. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and help me, help me, help me. And I think that's very true of many of us. And the reason Verizon Lisa talks to the universe is part of the same mechanism that, when we get into, think about Forrest Gump and Lieutenant Dan on the mast of the shrimp boat when they haven't caught any shrimp, and he's up there yelling at God in defiance about this and that. And of course, the boat is filled with shrimp, and it's the beginnings of Bubba Gump Shrimp. So it's a wild world. Either he answers and everything you enjoy about life becomes sin you've abstained from, or he doesn't, and the unopened box that might have hoped in becomes empty as the rest of your existence. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Usually it's a lot of stuff in between. All right, Max of Meaning. These are some good questions too. I really like these questions. The Gospels of Harry Potter were more effective in colonizing my childhood heart and imagination than were Bible stories. I thought I didn't believe in an age to come. Though I don't believe in an age to come, part of me is still deeply saddened that I never received my Hogwarts admissions letter. That was the story verse I wanted to inhabit. And if there was a Harry Potter themed church, I wouldn't miss a Sunday. Do you see J.K. Rowling's as akin to L. Ron Hubbard, having spawned a parasitic religious meme through fiction which captured some large number of millennials? No. J.K. Rowling's is a rather generous writer who made a good bit of money from her books, but she's not a grifter, not like Scientology. The difference between J.K. Rowling's and L. Ron Hubbard's, by your fruit you will know them. And I like how Peterson, well, it gets into a bunch of the rest of it, so I'll keep going. Or is she more of a C.S. Lewis, smuggling Christian motifs into children's lit? Yeah, but those things got smuggled into her. Because again, there are principalities and powers for good and for ill that are working in our midst. And basically what happened, and again, you can look at Peterson and Peterson's understanding of these stories. J.K. Rowling's, to her delight, Disney sort of did the same thing in terms of its rise, Pinocchio, and when it was making movies based on fairy tales instead of trying to write new ones, which was actually a smarter idea. You can see the wisdom of Disney as opposed to those who have inherited his kingdom. J.K. Rowling's was herself colonized by those archetypal stories, wasn't she? And she just managed to put new skin on them. I've made videos about this, but there's this great place where someone asks Peterson, I think it's in one of his classes actually, well, if there's such things as archetypal stories, why don't we have the definitive archetypal story that replaces all others of them? And I think an answer to that is partly in Matthew Pajot's Language of Creation book, because the archetype has to put on flesh. And sort of what happens in different cultures is it has to put on flesh in different cultures. And this is part of the reason why, churches are always trying to establish the pure church or the definitive church, and what we see, in fact, are churches that are contextually adapted to lots of different cultures and contexts. One of the reasons why I think Christianity is more true than the other religions is simply its power of adaptability that is greater than what we see in Judaism or Hinduism. Buddhism's pretty adaptable, but I haven't. Monday or Tuesday, I'm going to release a video where I'm reading some of a book, Severe Mercy, that gets into some of these questions. I've already made that video because it's a long weekend and I don't make videos on long weekends. I have a little bit of Sabbath. So, yeah. So was Rowling's wielding these ideas, or were these ideas wielding principalities, wielding J.K. Rowling's? And this gets into C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle. God is such a sneaky smuggler. He smuggles stuff in. Anyway, I'll keep going with your question. Is the boy who lived methadone of methadone Jesus Christ? Yeah, sometimes we have to have Jesus sort of cut down because we can't take him pure. He's too much for us. And fortunately, he's patient and gentle. The rich young ruler comes to him and okay, he kind of, okay, Jesus, how do I inherit eternal life? I don't know. How do I inherit the kingdom? Keep the law. I've done this. Oh, you want advanced stuff? Okay. Sell all you have and give to the poor. Try that. Careful what we ask for. Jesus almost always gives a very specific reply to people, and it almost always is something they didn't want to hear. Tell my brother to divide the inheritance. Be careful for all kinds of greed. That wasn't the answer I was looking for, Jesus. Jesus, come and heal my daughter. Why should I heal you when you're not a Jew? Jesus shouldn't say things like that, but he does, and he would heal her daughter, and we would all benefit from the answer. So, am I implicitly Christian if I learn through Lily Potter that loving sacrifice overcomes death? Yeah, it's getting in there. It's and it's sort of what C.S. Lewis does in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when he talks about the deeper magic. And it's what Rene Girard figured out and saw all over literature. And it's how C.S. Lewis in The Grand Miracle recognizes that Christianity must be the true story because of the power of agape to bring life out of a newborn child. That every mother brings a child into this world at the risk and sometimes the cost of her life, and every child grows up at the expense of the parents' lives. That there's this substitutionary sacrificial aspect to reality. And so then when Jesus comes and dies on a cross, well, thousands of other people had died on a cross. Why is this one special? Jesus was telling the story that always was. And when the book of Matthew says, this word of God won't go away, it's because it's always been here and it will outlast us. So no, I love this question, Max. Did those crazy Christians homeschooling parents have a point in banning Harry Potter books from their home libraries? Yeah, they had a point. Part of the point was if you ban something, the kids are really going to want to read it. Is children's literature the most important culture war of all? Yes. There, you want a clear answer? Yes. Yet, what's so interesting is that not only does your question ask whether, Harry Potter can beat the Bible, why is it, people ask me about child raising and Sunday school materials, and I just tell them, teach them the Bible stories. Do you mean those stories with all that violence and sex? Yeah, a lot of that stuff will go over the heads of kids. And later on, when they read the stories as adults, they'll see it through new eyes and say, oh. And a lot of people get annoyed when I actually use the Bible in church. There was a Mother's Day when I preached on Lot and his daughters. I was just going through the book, and that story just happened to land on Mother's Day. Where's the mother's application for, let's see, Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt, and they run and hide in the caves, and the daughters lament that they'll never have children, so they get Papa drunk, and 2 incestuous children become the neighboring nations around Israel. Oh, Pastor, what a lovely Mother's Day story. They were mothers. Oh, there's a reason that you're not going to get rid of the Bible. And there's a reason that in some ways the Bible is so fertile. It can fertilize J.K. Rowling's to tell archetypal stories. And, well, Harry Potter, just watch the end of it. Harry Potter dies. And Harry Potter comes back to life. And Harry Potter sacrifices himself for the welfare of Hogwarts. We just keep telling that story. It's a great question. All right. Oh, am I going to get done? I don't know. I've been discussing the themes of Harry Potter in relationship with Christianity with someone recently. There is also a humility overcoming pride dynamic. Harry casts away the Deathly Hallows and the Elder Wand. That's right. Which would make him the most powerful wizard. The Sorting Hat says, you could be great, but he turns from this, and there was a general expectation upon him to step into this kind of ultimate magical power as a wizard. That's right. Will Harry become a more evil and destructive Voldemort? This is an issue I preach about all the time, because what do Jesus' disciples want him to become? An emperor. And isn't that what the prophecy of Daniel 7 says? Isn't that why Jesus keeps calling himself the Son of Man? He's going to become the king of the world. Well, what kind of king actually rules the world? Well, we have it built into our systems. We call the President of the United States a public servant. The president should lay down his life for the nation. The nation isn't there to build up the president, although the president gets to live in a lovely house and gets all of our honors and all of this power. But the president should sacrifice himself for the welfare of the nation. And any president that doesn't do so doesn't understand true leadership. And this is why Jesus reveals the truth. Now, we look at him and say, I like my leaders uncrucified. But do we really? Jesus says, the disciples have sharp elbows. The greatest among you must be the servant of all. You want to be the greatest among? It's going to cost you your life. It's just true. So that's exactly right. And it's all through Harry Potter. By embracing death and turning away from the garments of skin. Ooh, someone's been reading Pajot. Voldemort so obsessively sought to acquire and put on, actually quite literally in one of the films. There's a sense to which he is dependent upon the agape love of those around him, which ultimately wins the day. That's exactly right. I think Harry consciously acknowledges this in a scene in The Order of the Phoenix. And this is why Christianity conquers, because it is the best story. Well, why is it the best story? Because it makes me feel the best? No, not necessarily. It's because it keeps winning. Because Peterson keeps saying you can't get around an archetypal story. And it's all there. This is why Pajot keeps doing the Pajot things. He keeps making the same point. Now, I think you're right. All right. Oh, there's so many good questions here. All right. Do you think the common understanding of hell as a place God sends people to be tortured forever is what the Bible actually says and means? Let me pause here and direct our attention to the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It is. People complain about Christianity on this score because it's been the most dominant religion in their context. Many traditions, in fact, it's probably one of the most common religious traditions in the world, once a conceptualization of an afterlife comes in, that in the afterlife, the consequences, in the afterlife, justice finally gets its say. Okay? You're not going to get around that idea. Now, lots of different traditions play with it in different ways. So let's think about reincarnation and karma. So maybe you were a horrible person in this life, so now you come back as a lower life form or something like that. They're playing in the same game. And again, it's interesting because we want to up the resolution here. Is this idea in the Old Testament? That gets hard. And we start looking about Sheol, and okay. And then we look at Lazarus and the rich man, and Jesus has both of them in Hades, read the Greek. But obviously there's two separate levels of accommodation in Hades with respect to the afterlife, because the rich man, well, he doesn't like where he's at, and he still wants to send Lazarus on errands back to the world to warn his brothers. And such a clever thing when Jesus says, even if someone comes back from the dead, they're not going to listen to him. Gosh, who might Jesus have been talking about right then and there? So, yeah, this is a pretty universal human conceptualization. Is it true? Well, let's keep reading the question. According to the arguments I've seen, the most common word translation as hell in modern Bibles was Gehenna. That's right. Which was the proper name for a place on planet Earth, just local to Jerusalem, in fact, and was the valley used as a garbage dump at times. It was also the valley in which children were sacrificed for the not too Deuteronomic kings that came along in Jerusalem history. It was also a place of pagan worship. With this in mind, it seems to suggest rather that souls are destroyed after death, which is exactly what atheists believe. Uh, don't atheists believe that there isn't really such a thing as a soul? At least there's no consciousness, it's just annihilation. But the good also get annihilated with the bad in the atheist. Everyone just goes into the big sleep, right? Either way, I don't think it actually matters as much as what Jesus was telling people to do. I'm interested on this subject because where I'm from, Christianity seems mainly to be practiced as a way to not go to hell and ignore the other 6 days of the week, and seeing the shallowness of it turned me away from the religion for many years. I think that's probably true. And so in reading Matthew Peugeot's book, we're at the two worlds mythology. And what's interesting, and this is something that I came to at some point, because even in the Christian Reformed Church, so often the church seemed to be about hell avoidance. And the more I read the Bible, the two worlds that the Bible seemed primarily focused on were heaven and earth, not heaven and hell. So, yeah. But yeah, once you have something like hell and judgment after life, better think about it. So I don't necessarily want to take us down the rabbit trail of annihilationism, universalism, but again, as I'll say and get into trouble with certain members of the Discord server, I read Jesus talking about shut doors and outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth, and I don't think we ought to too easily let the impact of those stories not sink in with us. So, yeah. But your main point that I see you making here, I think is absolutely correct. Because what does God want from us? And another little fact is that people seem to be judged, the sheep and the goats, all these judgment parables of Jesus, based on what they do and don't do. So the afterlife destination is connected with current life performance. Well, that sounds like a strange thing from someone who preaches misery, deliverance, gratitude every week. Yeah. It also has to deal with a relationality that gets expressed in certain ways. And part of the reason I preach misery, deliverance, gratitude is I don't think I can do enough. You have the end of Schindler's List where Oskar Schindler wonders, if I had lived a more simple life, if I had spent how many more Jewish lives could I save from the Nazi death camps? That's a real question. And I think part of the grace of the gospel is that we are freed from this. And I think that is also made clear in other stories, such as the parable of the prodigal son. And this is where I always get into spats with Christians over the interpretation of that parable, because I make the point that in the far off field with the prodigal son slopping pigs, the little story he tells himself is basically from the lips of Pharaoh. and that the Father's embrace of him is not based on the Son's wisdom or repentance necessarily. It's the Father's generosity towards the Son, which is the point that the Father makes when he goes out and pleads with the older brother to rejoin the party. This is why I continue to be a Calvinist, because if I base my eternal prospects on my performance, I know how bad my performance is. I would rather base my eternal prospects on the generosity of the master. That leads into another one of my favorite parables, which follows Luke 15, the parable of the shrewd, of the crooked, of the embezzling manager. And I really like Bailey's interpretation of that parable, because that parable ties Christians up in knots. And I like it because God finally rescues me. Salvation is of the Lord. And any good that I would do, I think, is in gratitude to him. I don't think I can. Now, this whole agency business gets complex, like I started out talking about, but I think your point is well made, and I wish more Christians would listen to your point, because I think it's something that the church needs to really ponder. Liliputinka. I would like to know how many people Paul thinks go to church and take part in a community without actually believing in God, because it's impossible to tell what goes on inside a person's mind and heart. So one could have a community of closet atheists. I think that's, and when part of the reason that I like Jordan Peterson was the skepticism he articulated with respect to the relationship between performance and overt belief. That's exactly right. Churches are very messy places, full of people with all the same messiness that each of us has between our own ears. And so just yesterday I caught on Twitter new revelations of Ravi Zacharias and all of the stuff going on behind the scenes. Doesn't surprise me. I understand why it disappoints. Doesn't surprise me. We're all a mess. And again, this is why I believe we're saved by grace. And, it's Frodo that wishes Bilbo had skewered Gollum when he was wearing the ring. Well, I think it's something in Bilbo that it was that same thing in Bilbo that spared Gollum, which was the same thing in Bilbo that took in Frodo, was the same thing in Bilbo that left the ring for Frodo. And all this stuff is just way too complex for us to really finally suss out. And the point you're making in this point is one that I keep trying to make to people, which is, yeah, churches are a mess. If you go into a church thinking, I'm going to find this wonderful community of people that is going to be everything I've ever wanted from a community, well, good luck. Because my guess is you're going to, maybe you'll have some rose-colored glasses of projection at the beginning, but you're going to find hypocrites and unbelievers and all kinds of people in that motley crew. But you're part of them too. And maybe together, with the leading of Christ, we can actually begin to see his glory in our midst. And that's what's so beautiful and engaging and exciting about church, and sometimes despairing. So it's a great question. 20 minutes. Still got more to go. Oh, I'm seeing the end. All right. Master Blaster. Christians often make claims that are testable under laboratory conditions. True. Sometimes they're testable under Donald Trump will be inaugurated June 6th. June 20, January 20. Wrong. Let's pull out our Bibles and open it to Deuteronomy 18 and all read together what is the penalty for making a prophecy in the name of the Lord that doesn't come to pass. It's stoning. You literalists. Do I think all these people that made those prophecies should be stoned? No, I don't. But I think how they respond to that might show us something about a lot of things. And so if you're going to have a prophecy, all right. If you get it wrong, I think you should go out with just as many internet viewers and say, I was wrong, because that's how we are. So Christians often make claims that are testable under laboratory conditions. Yet whatever we test these claims, such as prayer, we find no evidence that supports these claims. That's a big statement. Whenever, because even to the point of they've done a lot of this study on prayer, and some tests say yes, some tests say no. That isn't whenever. Now, you might say the better tests say no, but notice where we are now. Now, it's easier to say these prophets got it wrong about Donald Trump's presidency. That's easier to test. So if the point you're making that Christians get things wrong, that's easy. If a point you're making that prayer doesn't work the way pressing the little springs on this lens cap for my lens works, yeah, churches are. What's so funny is if you go into a church and say, I've got some bad news for you. God won't necessarily answer your prayer the way you ask it. This is not news to any Christian. It just isn't. Now you might say prayer doesn't work, and Christians will say, you're articulating my fears. Yeah, it's not news. Anyway, my question is, does it concern you that Christianity makes claims that we can demonstrate are not true or that have no evidence to support them? Sure, it concerns me. Sometimes what concerns, it's sort of the Mark Twain thing. It's not the stuff in the Bible that I can't understand that I have a problem with. It's the stuff I can. So yeah, that's true. But like I said before about human beings, please tell me the mystery about smoking, drinking, eating right, and exercising that we all sort of don't get. And now you can say to someone, not smoking, not drinking, eating right, and exercising will by and large give you a longer life. Yeah, by and large that's true, but really fit people die regularly. Life is like that. So it's I don't know what to say. I look at Scientology and you could say, well, I think it would be easier to point out the defects of Scientology, but it's still going on. It's just not how people work. People don't work. People aren't reasonable. It's not us. Okay, Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham keeps changing his name. I know who's behind Mr. Wickham. Paul, how much is the atheist perspective a product of the temperament of a person who might be more of a systematizer than most, or who might not have the inbuilt spiritual ability? I think there's probably some truth to that. Also, another one. My sister, a self-proclaimed atheist, attacked my mother, hopefully verbally and not with a baseball bat, with this when she was about 13. She was one of those smart atheists at 13. How do you say to or about kids in a geographic locale where they have never been taught or explicitly exposed to Christian perspective? How do they have a shot at salvation? Well, again, I'm going to default back to my Calvinism. If we're not saved by our works, we're also not saved by our decisions. We're saved by God's decisions. And this question of, well, And then we have to ask, saved from what? Saved by what? And saved to what? If I can believe that there's a life to come, and that that the life to come is somehow connected to this life, and that God is all knowing and all just and also merciful, I can believe he will do what's right with these questions. And I really can't answer them in a scientific way because I don't really have the data. At least at this point, no angel has showed up in my office with the book of life and has showed me, well, this is what's going to happen to poor Mr. Wickham. So I just work on trust here. Now, a lot of the way this conversation goes is, well, here's the thing. If you believe in Jesus, then you get to go to the good place. And if you don't believe in Jesus, then you get to go to the bad place. So believe in Jesus so you can get to go to the good place. And people say, okay, there we go. Now we're going to have a church service and we're going to have you trot down the aisle and we're going to dunk you in a tank. And there you have it. Okay. Really? But then what to do with the pastor who bought the massage parlors and did all those things to those women? Does he go to the good place or does he go to the bad place? The Christian answer has always been, God gets to decide that. Do we have some assurance from Christ about belief and obedience and discipleship to him that he is faithful? Yes. Do we have warnings and concerns about not being ready? Yes. But what about Mr. Wickham's sister? Well, I'll leave that to God because I know Mr. Wickham just a little bit. I don't know his sister at all. These are good questions, but yeah, I guess I would also ask how God would reveal himself in natural environments. He edited the question. Or someone edited the question. Rick, did you edit the question? No. Okay. We might get through them. We've got 12 more minutes. Jason M. See, this was actually just a sneaky way for me to out all the atheists on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. Now I know who are the sheep and who are the goats. It was so funny. Recently, I forget where it was. Oh yeah, someone called Vixen Dixon a goat, and Vixen Dixon's like, what? Greatest of all time. Oh, Vixen Dixon is the queen of the first game. So she always gets special notice. Okay, Jason M. Hi, Paul. Thank you again for the rando conversations we had last month. I especially liked your response regarding how one would reconcile the Lord of the Rings and Star Trek sharing the same universe, reconciling a religious and a scientific perspective. In your opinion, what books of the Bible are most useful for a non-believer to find the best insights about human nature and living a meaningful life? Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is sort of a secular-ish book, especially if you try to chop off the last chapter. And it's wisdom literature. So Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, hard to beat the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, phenomenal book. The synoptic, all four gospels. These are Samuel, book of Samuel, book of Ruth, Judges. I mean, it was so much fun meeting with the Bookwave guys and talking to them. And I know people got offended at my little joke about a whorehouse, but I'm a little offensive sometimes if you hadn't noticed. Yeah, it's just hard not to love the book of Genesis. There's a book, Mimesis, by who wrote Mimesis? I've got it right over there, but I don't want to get out of my chair and pick it up. Where the author compares the literature of Genesis versus the literature of Homer. And it's an amazing chapter. Genesis, Samuel, Ruth, Jonah, the Gospels, Ecclesiastes, some of my favorite books of the Bible. Just and you, just like Jordan Peterson keeps saying, you can't get to the bottom of these books. At so many levels, the artistry of these books, even if, okay, I don't believe in any of the supernatural stuff, whatever. Once you get into the nuance and complexities of these books, it's just astounding. I love it all. Okay, and this is the man, and I'm terrible at, Lee Letinature. Do you think it is possible not to suffer from the crisis of meaning? Yes, I don't think, when this meaning crisis stuff happened, I had a lot of Christians write me and say, I'm not having a meaning crisis. And I totally believed it. And I think that's what John Vervaeke says often too. He says, a lot of people in their religious traditions are not experiencing a meaning crisis. Now, John might go on to say that they, along with many other atheists or non-theists, that these Christians are a bit naive and not fully grappling with the philosophical challenges to Christianity that are out there, and they are out there and they are daunting. But the meaning crisis seems to be a result of dealing with those philosophical questions. But many believers are not having a meaning crisis at all. They live in a very enchanted world full of God doing wonderful things for them and God damning their enemies and purpose of existence and all of those things. And one of the arguments that I regularly come around to is, if in fact there is no purpose in the universe, why would you want to live in a universe knowing there is no purpose? And find me the ought that says I oughtn't to live in a re-enchanted universe. I just don't see where you can leverage. No, you must look into that empty nihilism of the grave and face it boldly. Screw your pride about that. I don't care about that. I want to sing love songs to Jesus. I'd much rather live this way. Give me the religious soma, baby. But yet deal with these questions we must. And if so, what does it say about such a person? That's a good question. In a sort of a lighthearted way, I made religious believers sound like people who are avoiding deep questions. Not everyone can handle the kinds of questions and conversations we're having here. I've told the story a few times lately about the man with Down syndrome who made profession of faith. He wouldn't have any ability to watch Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. But there are those of us who are cursed with a whole lot of gray matter and maybe a little higher level of anxiety, and we are faced with some really uncomfortable questions about the world. What I would say is that if you look over, people are looking to read more philosophy and more science, and that's great. I would also like for people to read more history, because what you find is that, read someone like Augustine. Brilliant man, incredibly influential in the shape of Western civilization. Agree or disagree, but read the Confessions. This guy knew how to face questions and faced them at levels and depths that, someone might just want to say, Augustine, stop overthinking. But his overthinking is to our benefit. So there are deep questions to wrangle with and to deal with and to engage with. And you can find Christians and non-Christians alike dealing with them. So, yeah, a meaning crisis perhaps is something that only a level of affluence and education can really afford. Blessed are you who have the affluence and education to have a meaning crisis and to be a nihilist. It was really wonderful to begin to learn John Vervaeke's stuff, because I thought he really helpfully contextualized Peterson's stuff, which a number of you have seen, and which I think Mark, in my conversation with him, which I put at the beginning of the conversation in edit, which I never do, so nicely articulated that, yeah, Peterson saw the nihilism all around him and knew that this was causing great suffering for people and wanted to help relieve people of it. And that's part of the reason he advocates responsibility, because you can, you can take on nihilism if you've got a goal. And that's true. So, running out of time. Evan, LC2R, not sure. I'm an atheist or not. Fair enough. But I'm reading Tom Holland's Dominion right now and thinking about how the Book of Kings relates to the revolutions throughout history. Interested to hear any thoughts. Well, the Book of Kings pretty much shows how violent government successions often are in the story of the world. And again, it's the Bible is an amazing book and a subtle book. And I mentioned this book a little while ago, Jacques Ellul's The Politics of God and the Politics of Man, very interesting book on the Book of Kings. And Jacques Ellul, perceptive thinker, has a lot to say about the Book of Kings. So there's a lot that can be said. Well, I've talked a whole lot for these last 2 hours, and y'all have been sitting patiently and nicely in the room, and I haven't given much chance for anyone from the room to ask a question. So before we go, this is your chance.
How far? Go ahead, Ramanki.
No, you go. I spoke ages before, so you go.
Okay, thank you. How far can one be off the right path and be redeemable within your frame?
I think the Bible answers that in a lot of different stories. The Apostle Paul was hunting down followers of Jesus, and Jesus stops him and says, I'm going to make you one of my chief instruments. And when one of those believers that Paul had been hunting down is tasked to go and pray for his enemy's welfare, and he says, oh, come on, Lord, you know what he was doing. God's answer to him was, I'll show him how much he must suffer. So I think the story of Christianity is there's no mountain high enough. There's no valley low enough. There's no ocean deep enough that can keep you from his love. So that's the kind of God I serve. Any other questions?
If you wanted to, you mentioned history, and that kind of touches on the questions that I had earlier, which we skipped over so we could get to the rest. But if you wanted to look at the second one of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. If we can agree that a proper understanding of history is important for understanding the nature of reality, our societies, communities, and how we should conduct ourselves moving forward, don't you think it is important to consider whether certain events in spiritual text actually occurred in the way that we say events in our personal history occurred? Oh, this is a question I am working so hard on. This is in some ways the big question that we are wrestling with respect to the Bible. I'll keep reading it. For example, part of my personal history is that I saw the corpse of my dead friend at his funeral. Isn't it important to know if in our human history Jesus raised the corpse of Lazarus, or Jesus himself was raised, then ascended? With all due respect to the symbolic and the metaphorical and other variants of truth that might be embedded in the story. Yes, 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 yes. And I've got a dozen videos in my head I've been unable to make. And one of them works on this. And of course, I can't resolve it in the span of even a 2 or 3 hour video. But this is part of the questions that we're dealing with. On one hand, does it matter that whether or not Jesus rose from the dead physically? Yes. And it makes all the world of a difference. And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. If it is symbolism alone, Paul basically intuits it is insufficient. And that's part of the reason I'm dogged on this point. Yet, there's a lot of complexity in this historical business. And so I've been listening, again, Tom Holland has a podcast, The Rest is History. And I'm really glad he's doing it because, obviously I can be a Rottweiler on someone like I was to Tim Keller and to Jordan Peterson, and now to a degree to Tom Holland, because why do I get so obsessed about working over some of these people and their ideas? Well, first of all, they're putting their ideas out there in the public domain, so it gives me examples and illustrations. Second of all, these are very intelligent people who are far better read than I am in certain aspects of life, and so they can teach me things. But they also are wrestling with the same kinds of questions that I'm wrestling with. And so when Tom Holland in his Christmas podcast talks about all of this stuff around Jesus' birth and it didn't really happen, and McGrew, what's her name? She's
Lydia McGrew.
That's it, Lydia McGrew. Starts making videos is on Unbelievable, talking about the historical value of the text. These things do matter. The problem is, let's imagine for a moment that the events of January with the storming of the Capitol are at least as well documented as anything we have around us right now. Okay? We've got smartphone footage, we've got security camera footage, we've got reporters, we've got thousands of primary sources who are accessible to us there. We as a nation, and right now there's a Senate trial underway at this moment to try to agree on what happened at the Capitol. Now, something happened. Can we boil it down into a sentence, into a paragraph, into a book, into a lifetime? So you're exactly right. History matters. Physicality matters. And I think that's part of the strength about Matthew Pajot's book, is that what we're about is where heaven and earth meets. But earth alone is dark, and heaven alone isn't what creation is after. So no, you're exactly right. These are really vital questions, but figuring out how they're vital and figuring out, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ on the same level as the question as to whether or not the book of Jonah is a parable or a historical account of how a man threw himself had himself thrown into the sea and was swallowed by a great fish. So no, this is all really hard stuff. And if you understand the flow of philosophy and the flow of history with everything that has happened, it's quite understandable why we would be wrestling with these things. But it's also pastorally understandable, because you're exactly right. When you go to a funeral, so just a few years ago, my sister at the age of 53 died of a sudden heart attack with absolutely no warning. My father died of a sudden heart attack with the warning that they got. The doctors looked all over my father, put him on a heart monitor for a month and said he was fine. And then the day he mails in his heart monitor, he walks down to have coffee with a guy and drops dead of a heart attack. Bang. And so I go and see him in a box. And my younger sister at 53 drops dead of a heart attack. Bang. And so I go and look at her in a box. And then, of course, I have two members of a family of 5 die of heart attacks. And so my primary care doctor says, well, now you get to have a cardiologist. I go see a cardiologist. The cardiologist says, wow, you have an impressive family history. Impressive wasn't the word I was looking for. The odds that I will drop dead of a sudden heart attack just got really good. And my sister dropped at 53 and my father dropped at 77. So, it could happen on this podcast. Now suddenly watching this is like NASCAR. Will Paul drop?
Ding,
For
ding,
my
ding.
mother's sake, I hope not. But that makes the question of the resurrection of Jesus all the more poignant. Because something in me wants to see my father again in the flesh and my sister again in the flesh. And part of me, when I saw them in the casket, knew something was wrong. My sister shouldn't have been in that casket with her son and her 2 daughters and her widowed husband crying in that room. So no, this is important stuff. And as the Apostle Paul says, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, well, it's all well and good to have symbolism about the circle of life and, death. And my father lives on in my heart. Oh, okay. Well, he was living on in my heart when he was alive too, but his death was certainly important. And my sister lives on in the hearts of my nephew and nieces. But there's a significant difference from her living in their heart and her living in their life like she was before they died. So, no, you're exactly right. Symbolic and metaphorical, these are powerful and these are good and these are true, but they are insufficient to Christianity. And so, a few years ago, there was some drama drummed up because there was an ossuary with Jesus' name on it. Until, of course, anybody who knew anything about that culture would say, you want to know how many, or the son of Joseph. You want to know how many Josephs there were in first century Palestine? You want to know, just read the New Testament and try and count how many Marys and Johns there are. So, it's finding a box with son of Joseph and the bones in it is hardly proof that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. But no, your point is exactly right. This means a lot. And yeah, it might be a good story if I can look at it merely symbolically, but it doesn't have the power if he walked out of that grave and Mary clung to him and Thomas put his fingers in his hands. That's a different story. And N.T. Wright argues that's why the church, the proof of that is in the disciples, because in N.T. Wright's book, the Resurrection of the Son of God, it's a long book, but it basically says what happened in terms of the origins of Christianity is very strange indeed, because on a historical basis, we would not imagine these people to be making these kinds of claims. Now, is it possible that this is just one of the weird things of history? Sure. But here we are. So,
yeah, thanks for that answer, because I do think I really appreciate that you emphasize the importance of the historicity there. Because one person who I've heard talk about this is John Cobb Jr., who is he's pretty pluralistic in some senses, but he does maintain a position within the Christian tradition. But he would say that as a spiritual tradition, one of the benefits of Christianity is that it does historicize. It brings people back to seeing themselves as part of a historical lineage, rather than like you can explore certain spiritual realities through something like Buddhism or Hinduism, but they can tend to be ahistorical. And so when I see this tendency for Christians who want to stay inside of Christianity to move towards the ahistorical, I wonder if they're just giving up the very thing that makes it the most worthwhile to stay there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. You might check out, again, Monday or Tuesday, I'll release a video where I read some of Sheldon Van Auken's A Severe Mercy. It's a powerful book. And it gets into a lot of these issues.
I might also recommend Laura Robinson's work. I think if you mentioned Lydia McGrew, and I think Laura Robinson is a really helpful counterweight to that, in terms of like, she's a Christian, really invested in the historical method. She's doing her PhD, I think, at I don't know, some theological institution that Moody, maybe, I don't know, Moody, one of the theological institutions that people would like in the States, but she talks about like the participatory reality of Christ, right? So she thinks that you should try and get there to this belief in Christ through like 2,000-year-old texts, right? But through the revelation that Christ is alive today. And going to 2,000-year-old texts treats it Christ is a lot more dead than he is in her estimation. Yeah, she points out some of the flaws and like some of the just the limitations of the historical method, and I think it's good to be honest with that stuff, right? And I like my what do you call it, willingness or like need to be honest with that is why I don't identify as a Christian, right? Because I just don't. I look at it, and I've done a lot of work in that area, and I just go, well, I'm just not in that place where I think it's useful to use that term. But that's not to say that I don't see how there could be any value in it and all that kind of stuff. But and thanks for sharing. I'll check out that video. But I thought maybe I would also share some of the things that have been bubbling around in my mind. If maybe that
thank you.
Help you.
We definitely have to do a conversation. I think that the problem I have is that I have a hard time not wanting to have more conversations with people like you. So there's only so much time.
I think this is what I would, whatever disagreements that I have with some ideas that bubble around in different communities like this, I think that's what drew me at least to you, is that I think I'm similarly wired. I just enjoy having these kinds of conversations with people, and so I can totally understand how you ended up in the situation you're in with having all these conversations and all that kind of stuff. So.
Well, it's a delight. Well, thank you, and thank you for asking great questions, and thank you to everyone who asked great questions, and sorry to some of you. Now, if you have other questions, you didn't get them in today and you're an atheist, you can ask on all the other weeks too. It isn't just for Christians. And I know some of those Christians have sharp elbows and they, want to get their questions answered, and they're zealous and motivated. And, but I appreciate, and part of the reason I wanted to do a week like this is, I get challenged by questions like this. And like I said before, I have members of my Consciousness Congress that are stewing on these things inside my head. And for you to ask the question sharper than I can and challenge me, you help me in this. And so I appreciate it. So I guess, Rick, we're about ready to sign off here. And so I just want to thank everyone who gathered in the voice chat for this, and those of you who gathered in the chat on YouTube. And I hope you have a great day, and Lord willing, we'll do this again next week. And I'll try and pick up some of the questions that are in the other chat. And if you come into the Discord server and you don't know your way around, just ask somebody. Usually there are people here who are helpful, and we'll steer you in the right way. And all right, Rick, I guess we're ready to end transmission.